Hey, welcome back to day number 8 of One Zentangle A Day. We have finished the first chapter. We're moving on to chapter 2. And I'd like to point out the very first thing that it talks about up here before we even dive into day 8. This is sort of an introduction to chapter 2, the second week. Notice up here it's talking about the importance of practice and also the importance of making these your own. A lot of people get caught up in trying to make things perfect or exactly right. The whole purpose, remember, the whole purpose of a Zentangle is to find your inner peace. And especially in a time like this where we've got school closures, business closures, everyone's scared about illnesses and what the future is going to look like for lots of different reasons. This is just a great way to just focus your mind, stop being distracted by all the horrible things that are going on, and find some inner peace. If you're struggling with it, don't struggle. Stop struggling. Just let it be. As we move on and talk about day 8 here, notice that we've got a couple of different things going on. We're talking about 2 new patterns, which I will be demonstrating here. But we are also talking about tonal value and how you can create shapes, 3-dimensional shapes like spheres and cones, by using different values of shading and understanding where the light source is coming from. And if you understand value as it pertains to the patterns themselves, like this is a darker pattern and this is a lighter pattern, that tonal value can help you to make your Zentangles look more like 3-dimensional shapes or forms. This is kind of an advanced concept and it's not 100% necessary to do, but it is one of those things that links Zentangles back to non-abstract art. We've been talking at several different intervals about how these skills that you learn here can be transferred into more traditional art styles. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate these 2 patterns, and then instead of actually making, a Zentangle tile like we've been doing, I'm going to finish up today by demonstrating some of these techniques of how to use the patterns to create 3-dimensional looking-ish forms. So let's start off with the Vega pattern. Notice that these curves here are not drawn in with a pencil. The red marks are always what you draw with a pen. So I'm going to make 2 curves with a pen. These are not intended to be strings like you would normally draw with a pencil. These are intended to be part of a loop in a pattern. Okay. Next, you can see these sort of rings that wrap around. It almost reminds me of rings around a planet, like rings around Jupiter or something. But the way that they wrap around kind of makes it look like this. These 2 curved lines make almost like a cylinder, and then they have like a string or something wrapped around it. And the way that we draw that is we start at one edge, we bump out, wrap around, bump out again, come back in. And we make 2 of those together real close. Then we skip a space, and we make 2 of those together real close. And then we skip a space. And then the next step is to do the exact same thing but diagonal to, crisscrossing to the ones you've already made. And notice how these overlap underneath the ones we've just made. So just to get a better angle, I'm going to kind of turn. And the next ones I'll be doing kind of catty corner, opposite direction. So I'm going to kind of come from right underneath this one, but go through that one. Again, kind of right underneath this one, go through that one. And if you can hear my children in the background at any point, that's just because, you know, we're all self-quarantining here, so kind of in tight quarters, and it's kind of hard to, you know, expect them to be silent while I'm doing this. Anyway, next step is to jump in between those X's and make diamonds. And those diamond shapes get filled in dark. And then not just the space between the X's, but also the spaces between where those crisscross and the edge of the loop, if there is a space. Now I think mine are kind of too close together. Maybe I've got a little bit of a space there and there for tiny little corners, but not much. Last step is to apply some shading, and the shading here is in two parts. Number one, there's a cast shadow underneath it. That's around the outside edges, outside of the actual loopy shape we've made. And then the second part of the shading is on the inside of the loop, darkest around the edges and lightest in the middle. That makes it look curved. Next, for the Purk pattern, we are going to start with the pencil, making a big sort of oval-shaped string, or an egg shape. And then we're going to do something very similar to what we did with Vega, but notice how it's got sort of more of an S-curve shape to it, and they don't crisscross each other. So the way we do that is we start on one side, we sort of curve up, and then over, and then up again. And again, it's two parallel close together within an empty gap between. So two parallel close together. And then I'll leave an empty gap. Now that it looks like an Easter egg with some stripes painted around it, we're going to put some circles between the stripes. Notice that the circles are as big as the space between the stripes. So we're going to start with just one row of circles, and then we'll add more. If the stripes are a little farther apart, then the circle is a little bigger. And then these ones at the ends are going to be smaller. Next, when we make the rest of these circles in here, we want them to be in nice, neat rows. We don't want to just like space them out randomly. Just like these are in a nice, neat row, I want to make another nice, neat row. And don't forget to darken in the space between those circles and around those circles, like this. And finally, you notice in the last step here, we've got rows of circles, tiny circles that go inside those stripy bits that wrap around. Now when we shade this, there's actually going to be 3 parts to the shading this time. The first 2 are going to be exactly the same as what we did on Vega. So number 1 is a cast shadow underneath it that's just going to help lift it up off the page around it. Make it feel like it's floating above and casting a shadow on the surface under it. And then the second is a little bit of shading around the edges on the inside that gets lighter as you work your way in. And that just helps to emphasize the roundness of the pattern itself. Make it feel like it is more of a 3-dimensional egg shape rather than just a flat oval. And then the last part is we want each individual one of these circles to feel sort of like a pearl or an inlaid gem of some kind. So these each want to feel round on their own. So to do that, we just pick a direction that we want the shadow to be on, and we make that consistent across all of them. And there. So those two patterns both have some things in common. We're understanding a lot about value, how to use our shading to create value, and how to use that value to create three-dimensionality. All of that is just building upon the things we've already talked about in Chapter 1 with the first week. But now let's put it together to make some 3D shapes out of our tangles. Alright, so here I've drawn two cones. One of them I have shaded to look basically like this one. The idea here is just it's got a light source shining, that side's the highlight, the other side is darkest, and it kind of is a blend from one to the other. So this one is darkest on this side and gets lighter as it moves towards the highlight, and then a little bit darker on the side there too, but the highlight is sort of right here. Anyway, this one doesn't have any shading at all, but what I want to do is use my patterns to make it look three-dimensional. And let's take this as an example, this sphere here. This is made out of the tipple pattern from day one, long time ago. The tipple pattern, it's just circles, so it should be pretty easy for us. But notice what they've done. Notice how in the middle of the sphere, the part of it that is raised towards us, the circles are bigger. And then as they spread to the outer edges, they're smaller and they're kind of squished and flatter around the edges. So we could consider the same thing here. I could start with some big circles right down the center. Notice that they are getting a little smaller as they go up. That's because I know that I am going to have to fit into that tight gap at the top. And then I'm going to make another row of circles, I should say column, because it's not horizontal, it's vertical. And again, it's going to be sort of bigger at the bottom and working its way a little bit smaller at a time until it gets to the top. And I'm not worried about filling in every gap. Remember, with the tipple pattern, we always go back in and fill all the gaps later. But as I swing around to the edge, I want these to get kind of squished, so they're going to be more ovally now. And there, it makes this part right here look like it is closer to us because the circles are larger, and it makes it look like these circles aren't flat to us, they're turned at an angle away from us. And then we'll just go in the in-betweens just like you do with tipple and fill with little circles in between, anywhere where you have gaps. And if you notice, that's the same kind of idea that we've already done right here. The circles are biggest in the middle and they're smallest at the bottom and at the top. Well, it's the same idea. They're biggest in the middle where it's raised up towards us, and then they're smallest at the edges and at the peak. We can then go back in and shade this the same way that we shaded Purk, or the same way that we shaded this cone over here. Now, at this point, I think I need to adjust my camera settings because I'm not 100% sure that that is showing up, that shading. I think that helped a little bit. I think you can kind of see the shading a little better. Now, the other thing, if we're thinking about cast shadows, in this case, we just put a cast shadow around the object to make it look like it's floating above the page. Like if my hand is, well, floating above the page, you can kind of see there's a little bit of darkness underneath my hand where the shadow is being cast onto the book underneath my hand. But we could also do a cast shadow, like in this case, think of this as a cone that's standing up and a light might be shining onto the side of it and then casting a shadow onto the table off, like into, this direction. So if we wanted to get super fancy with it, we could do our cast shadow going off to the edge that way. And while that is a little bit outside of the purview of traditional Zentangle tiles, there are tons of people. You can go just do a Google search for Zentangle animals or Zentangle names or Zentangle words or things like that. There are people that take these Zentangle patterns and do all sorts of different things with them. I mean, you can find pictures of eagles or owls or bunny rabbits or people who've written their name out in fancy letters. And anyway, this is just an example of how you can take these Zentangle concepts and make whatever you want out of it. So that's it for today. I'm not actually going to make a tile today. I will tomorrow. Tomorrow is going to be a special way of making a tile. I can't wait to show it to you. But speaking of tomorrow, if you're enjoying this series so far, hit the subscribe button, like the video, share it with your friends, and come join us again tomorrow for day 9.